I want to say something today that almost nobody says. And the reason almost nobody says it is that it sounds like the wrong thing to say. It sounds like discouragement. It sounds like the opposite of the gentle reassurance that people in this season of life are usually offered. The soft insistence that these are the golden years, the harvest years, the years of well-earned rest and richly deserved peace. And I want to be careful here because I am not saying those things are lies. In time, they can become true. They do become true for many people, on the other side of something. But I have sat with too many people between the ages of 65 and 75 who were quietly drowning in a difficulty nobody was naming to continue offering the comfortable story without first offering the honest one. So here is the honest one. The decade between 65 and 75 is, for most people, the hardest decade of their entire life. Not the decade of greatest external suffering. You may have had harder things happen to you in your 40s, or your 30s, or your 20s. Things of greater objective severity. But this decade is the hardest in a different and more interior way. It is the hardest because it is the decade in which everything that was previously holding you in a recognizable shape falls away. Sometimes all at once, sometimes in a sequence that feels designed to give you just enough time to catch your breath before the next thing goes. And you are left standing inside a life that no longer looks like the life you knew how to live, holding an identity that no longer fits, and being asked, without any preparation, to build something new from the inside out at the exact moment when your energy for building is not what it used to be. That is what this decade asks of you, and it is the most demanding thing life ever asks. Today I am going to tell you why, not to frighten you, not to diminish what is genuinely beautiful about this time, but because understanding why something is hard is the first and most powerful step toward moving through it with your whole self intact. The first reason 65 to 75 is the hardest decade is that your identity disappears, often almost overnight, and nothing arrives to replace it. This is the thing nobody prepares you for. The retirement party happens, the cake is cut, the card is signed by people who mean it warmly, and then Monday morning arrives, and the structure that has organized your days, your sense of purpose, your understanding of who you are in the world, the thing that answered the question, "What do you do?" which has always been standing in for the question, "Who are you?" is simply gone. And you are standing in a house that is suddenly very quiet, wearing the clothes of a person who no longer has anywhere to be, and you discover, with a shock that is genuine no matter how much you thought you had anticipated it, that you do not know who you are without the role. This is not a failure of imagination. It is not a failure of preparation. It is what happens when an identity is externally constructed across decades, and then the external structure is removed. The work did not just give you something to do. It gave you a place in the social order, a set of relationships organized around function, a daily rhythm that answered the question of how to spend each hour before the question was even asked. And all of that disappears at once. My grandfather understood something about this that he called the name problem. He said, "The trouble with spending 40 years being called by your title is that when the title is gone, you forget what your real name sounds like. And a man who has forgotten his real name is a man who has to go back to the beginning and remember it from scratch." I knew a man named Walter who had been a physician for 38 years. Brilliant, respected, needed in the immediate and daily way that very few people are needed. He retired at 67, and within 6 months he told me he felt like a ghost. Not unhappy exactly, transparent, as though the substance of him had been in the role, and without the role he was moving through rooms that could no longer quite feel him. He tried things, he took classes, he filled time with activity, but activity is not identity, and he knew the difference. What Walter was going through was not depression, though it resembled it. It was the labor of constructing a self that did not depend on function. The hardest construction project of his life, undertaken at 67 without a blueprint and without the energy he would have brought to it at 35. That labor is real. It deserves to be named. And if you are in the middle of it right now, I want you to know that what you are feeling is not weakness, and it is not ingratitude, and it is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is the exact difficulty of the thing you are being asked to do. The thing you are being asked to do is profound, and it takes time, and it is worth it. The second reason this decade is the hardest is that the grief begins arriving from a direction it has never come from before. When you are young, grief comes from above. You lose grandparents, then parents, the generation ahead of you. And grief from above, while genuine and sometimes devastating, carries inside it a certain natural order, a sequence that the mind can accommodate because it fits the expected shape of things. The old go first. But in the decade of 65 to 75, for the first time, grief begins arriving from beside you, people your own age, contemporaries, the people who shared your references and your memories and the particular texture of the era you grew up inside. The people whose existence confirmed your own in some way that is difficult to articulate, but is felt immediately and devastatingly in their absence. And that grief is different in kind from the grief that came before, because it carries inside it a message that the grief from above did not carry. It carries the message that you are next in line. Not imminently, not necessarily soon, but next. The generation that was between you and the end is gone, and there is nothing now standing between you and the full knowledge of your own mortality in a way that you can no longer organize your days around not thinking about. I knew a woman named Iris who lost 3 friends in the span of 14 months when she was 68. 3 women she had known since her 30s, women who had been part of the fabric of her weekly life, whose voices she had heard more times than she could count, whose faces had been as familiar as furniture. And Iris told me that what undid her was not the grief for each of them individually, though that grief was real and deep. What undid her was the mathematical quality of it. The way 3 losses in 14 months felt like information, like the universe presenting data she was being asked to receive. She said, "I have always known I was going to die, but I had been knowing it the way you know something that is true but not yet real. And then it became real, in a way I could not unknow." My grandmother said about grief of this kind, "When the people who walked beside you begin to fall, you do not speed up and you do not slow down. You walk more deliberately. You look at the road more carefully. You notice every stone and every blade of grass because you understand now, in your bones, and not just in your mind, that the road has a length, and you are on it, and the walking is the gift. Walk more deliberately. That is not a small instruction. It is the entire adjustment that this grief is asking you to make. The third reason this decade is the hardest is that the body stops being background and insists on becoming foreground. For most of your adult life, if you were reasonably healthy, the body was something you inhabited without much notice, the way you inhabit a house you have lived in for decades without consciously experiencing the walls. It handled itself. It allowed you to direct your attention outward, toward the work and the relationships and the projects and the concerns of living. And then, somewhere in this decade, it stops doing that. Not all at once, and not for everyone in the same way, but with enough consistency and enough insistence that you can no longer maintain the outward direction of attention that your entire adult life has been built upon. The body becomes a project, a conversation, a negotiation that takes up space in the day that used to be available for other things. This is disorienting in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has not yet experienced it, because it is not simply inconvenience, it is a shift in the fundamental orientation of your attention, inward in a way that feels at first like constriction and is actually, if navigated correctly, the beginning of a different and deeper relationship with the self. My grandfather had a way of talking about the body in old age that I have never heard matched. He said, "When you are young, the body is a horse you ride. You point it in the direction you want to go, and it takes you there, and you do not think much about the horse. But when you are old, the horse starts to have opinions, and your job changes from rider to partner. You have to learn to listen to the horse. You have to learn to negotiate. And a man who was a rider his whole life does not become a partner easily. It takes humility he may have never needed before." That humility, the humility of learning to be a partner to a body that used to simply obey, is some of the hardest inner work this decade requires. I knew a man named George who had been, his entire adult life, in the habit of simply overriding his body's signals with the force of his will. Tired? Keep going. Hurting? Push through. The body was a tool, and tools did not get to have preferences. And at 69, his body presented a bill for 5 decades of being treated as a tool that George had not anticipated and could not override. The recovery required everything he had. And in the bed where it happened, he told me, "I never talked to my body. I just used it. I'm only now learning we were supposed to be in conversation." Start the conversation. It is not too late, but start it now before the body has to shout to be heard. The fourth reason, and the one that surprises people most when I name it, is that this decade is when your closest relationship is stress-tested in ways it has never been tested before. And the test is one that many relationships do not pass. If you are with a partner, retirement and the changes of this decade put you both in the same space for more hours of the day, with fewer of the external structures that previously gave each of you independent purpose and individual rhythm, than at any time since the very beginning of the relationship. And what is revealed in that proximity, after decades of a relationship organized partly around mutual absence, is sometimes wonderful and sometimes devastating, and almost always surprising. You discover things about each other that 40 years of busy, parallel living successfully concealed. Incompatibilities of rhythm and temperament that the schedule of working life absorbed become newly visible and newly significant. The things you agreed, without discussing it, to never fully look at, are now in the room all day. And if you do not have the language and the willingness to address them directly, they expand to fill all the available space. If you are alone in this decade, through widowhood or divorce, or the long practice of solitude, the stress test is different, but equally real. Because what this decade does to people who are alone is remove the last of the external structures that provided daily human contact, the colleagues and the professional relationships, and the working world's ambient community, and leave them in a quiet that is absolute in a way it has never been before. And in that quiet, the question of connection, of genuine, sustaining, present-tense human connection, becomes urgent in a way that may not have been allowed to be urgent before. I knew a woman named Frances who had been so effectively self-sufficient her entire adult life that she had not noticed until 68 that self-sufficiency had become a substitute for intimacy rather than a complement to it. The decade stripped away the structures that had been keeping the distinction invisible, and Frances, in the first 2 years of it, was more genuinely lonely than she had ever been, not because she was more alone, but because she finally had the quiet to hear it. My grandmother said, "The decade after 65 does not create your problems. It removes the noise that was covering them. And what you find in the quiet is always true, even when the truth is uncomfortable, especially then." Before I share the final reason, one important note. Everything I have been pulling from these years, the teachings about the hardest passages of a long life and how to move through them with your whole self present, I have written it all down. 20 teachings, 4 parts, in the order they were meant to be received. It is called The Native Way. The link is in the description of this video. But stay right here because the final reason is the one that people tell me explained everything else they had been feeling and could not name. The 5th reason, 65 to 75, is the hardest decade, is the most fundamental and the most inescapable of all. This is the decade in which you come face to face, for the first time without an exit, with the question you have been too busy to answer your entire life. The question is not, "What do you do?" That question has been answered, and the answer is changing. The question is not, "What have you accomplished?" That question is behind you. The question is, "Who are you?" Not what role do you play, not what function do you serve, not what do others need from you. Who are you, actually, when all of that is removed? What do you believe? Not what were you raised to believe, not what has been convenient to believe, but what you actually believe, earned through 65 years of living. What do you love? Not what have you loved because it was expected or practical or what love was available, but what you genuinely, privately, irreducibly love. What kind of person are you when the performance is over and the audience is left and it is just you in a quiet room with enough time, finally, to find out? That question is the gift of this decade, disguised, very effectively, as a crisis. I knew a man named Bernard who reached 66 and told me he felt completely lost. And I told him something that took him a long time to understand. I said, "You are not lost. You are found. The person you have been since you were old enough to start performing for the world is lost. But the person underneath that performance, the one who has been waiting since childhood to have enough quiet to speak, is closer to you right now than they have ever been. Your job in this decade is not to find your way back to the person you were. Your job is to finally meet the person you actually are." Bernard sat with that for months, and then, slowly, the way something emerges from water when the surface finally stills, he began to know things about himself that he had never known. What he found was not the person he had been performing. It was quieter than that, more particular, less impressive by conventional measures, and more genuinely his. He told me at 71, "I spent 66 years becoming someone. I have spent the last 5 being someone. And being is so much better than becoming that I cannot explain the difference. I can only tell you it is the difference between a picture of fire and a fire." This is what the decade of 65 to 75 is actually for. Not for golden rest, not for the comfortable harvest of all the years before it. It is for the stripping away of everything that was never really you, so that what remains can be identified and inhabited and lived in the time that follows. And yes, the stripping away hurts. Of course it hurts. Things that have been attached to you for decades do not come away cleanly. They come away with something, and what they take feels sometimes like a piece of you, until you discover that what they took was only the covering, and underneath the covering, you are more whole than you have been since childhood. My grandfather made it through this decade and out the other side, and I watched the transformation from close enough to touch it. He went in as a man who knew what he was for. He came out as a man who knew who he was. And the difference, which I did not fully understand when I was young enough to watch it, is the difference between a life built for others and a life finally inhabited by the person it belongs to. You are inside that decade now, or approaching it, or looking back on it with recognition from the other side. Whatever your position, I want you to know that the difficulty is real, and it is worth it, and you are not doing it wrong. You are doing the hardest and most important work a human life ever asks of you. And the person you are becoming in the doing of it is the person you were always meant to arrive at. You are not lost. You are almost there. If what you heard today stayed with you, the book is there. The Native Way, 20 teachings, 100 pages, written the way I would speak to you if we were sitting together in the middle of the hardest decade, with enough honesty between us to say what it actually is. The link is in the description. Read 1 chapter. Sit with it. Now I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you are in this decade and whether what I described today is what you have been living through without a name for it. I read every comment. And if this is the kind of conversation you have been looking for, subscribe to this channel. We are not collecting viewers here. We are collecting people who remember. Come back next week. I am not done teaching.